The first 2 weeks of homelessness were pure survival mode. I was so focused on the immediate logistics, where to park safely. I didn't have any mental space for planning beyond the next 24 hours. I showered at the YMCA on Post Street, changed in public restroom stalls, and spent my days driving to different neighborhoods. I had to submit job applications while pretending I had an address to put on the forms.
I never believed that wrought iron gates could tell stories until the afternoon I stood outside a particular estate in Pacific Heights, San Francisco, waiting for someone I'd only known through public records and a brief, cryptic phone conversation. The neighborhood itself seemed to whisper rather than speak. Streets lined with mature sycamore trees that had been planted when my grandparents were children, homes set so far back from the sidewalks that you could barely see their facades, and an almost eerie quietness that suggested the kind of wealth that doesn't need to announce itself. There were no McMansions here, no architectural showboating, no cars that screamed for attention. Just old money sitting comfortably in its inheritance, generation after generation, behind gates that rarely opened for strangers. The address I'd been given led me to one such gate. Elegant, understated, with no nameplate, no intercom button labeled with a family name, nothing that suggested who lived beyond it. Just a simple call box and a camera that had probably been watching me since I'd parked my car 3 houses down. I pressed the button, announced myself, and waited in that peculiar silence that expensive neighborhoods seem to cultivate like a crop. When the gate began its slow, mechanical swing inward, I saw her for the first time. She was standing on the front steps of a restored 1920s Mediterranean revival estate, the kind of home that gets featured in architectural digests not because it's flashy but because it represents something increasingly rare: authenticity, history, impeccable preservation. The woman herself matched the house in an almost uncanny way. Late 50s, I'd guess, though she had that quality of aging that wealthy women seem to master, where you can't quite pinpoint their exact age because everything about them suggests they've been taking care of themselves at a cellular level for decades. She wore what I would later understand was her version of a uniform: white linen shirt, wide-leg navy trousers with a break so perfect it suggested either a very good eye or a very good tailor, minimal jewelry that looked antique rather than trendy, and an expression of calm self-possession that I'd only ever seen on people who'd never worried about money or had worried about it so intensely at one point that they'd transformed that fear into something unshakable. She waited for me to walk up the stone pathway, not rushing down to greet me, not anxious about my impression, just standing in her own space with the kind of stillness that comes from absolute certainty about belonging exactly where you are. When I reached the steps, she extended her hand, and her grip was firm but not aggressive, accompanied by direct eye contact that felt like being seen rather than examined. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice carrying the particular kind of calm that I associated with therapists and meditation instructors. "I'm Lorelei Ashford. I believe you wanted to hear about how I ended up here." I nodded, introducing myself, explaining that I was a journalist working on a piece about unconventional paths to wealth, and that her name had come up in my research, specifically, a gap in public records that showed her listed as transient in county databases from 2015 to 2016, and then, inexplicably, as the owner of this property and 2 others by 2019. The transition seemed impossible, the timeline absurd, and I'd driven 3 hours to understand how someone could go from homeless to homeowner in a neighborhood where the median property value exceeded $8 million. Lorelei smiled at that, a slight curve of her lips that suggested she'd heard the skepticism before and found it reasonable. "I used to sleep in my car," she said, gesturing toward the street beyond her gate, 2 miles from here actually. Pacific Avenue, near the park. I'd found a spot where the streetlights weren't too bright and the police didn't patrol as frequently. My daughter was 3 years old. We'd been living in that car for about 6 weeks when I started noticing things that would eventually change both our lives completely. She invited me inside, and as I followed her through rooms that managed to be both museum quality and comfortably lived in, antique Persian rugs that showed we're in exactly the right places, built-in bookshelves filled with first editions and family photographs, furniture that looked like it had been collected over decades rather than ordered from a single store, I understood that whatever story she was about to tell me wasn't going to be a simple rags-to-riches tale. There was too much intentionality in every detail, too much evidence of studied observation and careful replication. We settled in her sunroom, a space that overlooked a garden designed in the Italian style with gravel paths, boxwood hedges, and climbing roses that looked like they'd been there for 40 years even though I suspected they'd been planted much more recently. Lorelei poured tea from a proper teapot into cups that didn't match but clearly belonged together, and then she began. The year was 2015, Lorelei said, her voice taking on the particular quality of someone who'd told this story before, perhaps to herself, organizing the narrative until it made the kind of sense that only hindsight provides. I was 31 years old, recently separated from my daughter Margot's father. A man who'd convinced me over the course of our 5-year relationship that my instincts were wrong, my perceptions were flawed, and my value was contingent on how well I managed his emotional needs. Leaving him meant leaving the apartment we'd shared, the job he'd convinced me to quit so I could support his career, and any illusion of financial stability I'd been clinging to. I had about $800 in a savings account, a 12-year-old Honda Accord that consumed oil at an alarming rate, and a 3-year-old daughter who deserved so much better than what I could offer her. She paused, looking out at her garden with an expression that suggested she was watching a film of her younger self rather than simply remembering. The first 2 weeks of homelessness were pure survival mode. I was so focused on the immediate logistics, where to park safely, where to use bathrooms, how to keep Margot fed and clean, and unaware of just how precarious our situation was, that I didn't have any mental space for planning beyond the next 24 hours. I showered at the YMCA on Post Street, changed Margot in public restroom stalls, and spent my days driving to different neighborhoods to submit job applications while pretending I had an address to put on the forms. Lorelei refilled my teacup with the kind of fluid, unconscious grace that suggested she'd been performing this gesture her entire life, though I suspected the truth was more complicated. But something shifted in the 3rd week. I'd been parking in different wealthy neighborhoods each night, rotating my location to avoid attention, and I started developing favorites. Pacific Heights became my preferred spot because it had particular qualities that I couldn't quite name at the time, but that made me feel safer. The streets were quiet but not deserted. The homes were set back far enough that no one was peering out their windows at my car. The streetlights were gentle rather than harsh. And the people I occasionally saw walking dogs or returning from evening events moved through the space with this unhurried quality that I found almost hypnotic. She leaned forward slightly, her expression intensifying. One night, I was parked on Pacific Avenue, Margot asleep in her car seat in the back, and I watched a woman, probably in her early 70s, walk from her house to her mailbox. It was maybe a 30-foot distance, completely unremarkable, the kind of thing that happens on every residential street in America every single day. But the way she did it arrested my attention completely. She wasn't rushing even though it was nearly 9 p.m. and fully dark. She was wearing what looked like cashmere. I recognized it because my grandmother had owned a cardigan in that particular soft, expensive texture, in weather that was probably 75 degrees. She collected her mail with deliberate slowness, actually reading the return addresses right there at the mailbox rather than carrying everything inside in a bundle. And then, as she turned back toward her house, she paused to deadhead a rose that was past its prime, removing the wilted bloom and putting it in her pocket rather than dropping it on the ground. Lorelei's voice grew quieter but more intense. That pocket moment. That's when I understood I was watching something I needed to learn. This woman was thinking about aesthetics even when no one was watching, even for an action as small as removing a dead flower. She was moving through her own space like she had all the time in the world. And everything about her, the cashmere in warm weather, the deliberate pace, the attention to small details, suggested she'd been raised in a culture I'd never been taught to speak. Wealth wasn't just having money. Wealth was a language, a set of patterns and signals and behaviors that got transmitted generationally. And I was functionally illiterate in that language, which meant that even if I somehow acquired money, I'd never be able to keep it or grow it or pass it on because I didn't understand the underlying code. I found myself leaning forward, completely absorbed, as Lorelei continued. That realization should have been crushing. Here I was, homeless with a toddler, recognizing that I was missing fundamental knowledge that other people had absorbed from birth. But instead, it felt clarifying. Because if wealth was a language, that meant it could be learned. It wasn't magic or luck or something you were born with in your DNA. It was a system of patterns, and I'd always been good at recognizing patterns. I'd scored in the 98th percentile on pattern recognition tests in school, had naturally gravitated toward puzzles and systems and organizing chaos into structure. I'd just never applied those skills to studying wealth because I'd been too busy surviving poverty. Lorelei stood and walked to a bookshelf, pulling down a worn notebook that looked like it had been handled thousands of times. I bought this notebook the next day for $1.97 at a CVS, and I started documenting everything I observed. I called it my field guide to wealth, though at the time I had no idea if what I was documenting was actually useful or just the paranoid observations of someone who'd lost all perspective. But I had nothing else to do while sitting in my car waiting for morning, so I watched and I wrote. She opened the notebook, and I could see pages filled with detailed observations written in careful handwriting. Woman in gray cashmere, August 12, 9 p.m. Walked to mailbox, deadhead rose, wore no jewelry except thin gold wedding band and watch. Car in driveway, 2004 Volvo wagon, clean but not new. Garden, roses, lavender, boxwood, English style, maintained but not fussy. Lights inside house, warm, dim, no television glow visible. I documented everything, Lorelei said, her finger tracing the words she'd written nearly a decade ago. What they wore, what they drove, how they landscaped their properties, what time they left for work, what groceries they carried inside. And patterns emerged immediately. The truly wealthy in this neighborhood, and I learned to distinguish between old money and new money very quickly, they all shared certain characteristics that had nothing to do with how much they spent and everything to do with how they moved through the world. She flipped through pages, pointing out observations. They wore the same things repeatedly. I'd see the same woman in variations of the same outfit, white shirt, navy or beige pants, simple shoes, week after week. But the quality of those items was exceptional. The white shirts weren't from Target, they were from Italian makers, probably cost $300 or $400 each, and they'd been tailored to fit perfectly. The shoes were European leather, and I noticed people took them to a cobbler to be resold rather than replacing them. The cars were older models, Volvos and Audis from 2005 to 2010, maintained meticulously but not flashy. The landscaping looked effortless but was clearly maintained by professionals. I started recognizing the same landscaping trucks servicing multiple houses. Lorelei's voice took on a different quality, something between academic analysis and personal revelation. But the most significant pattern was the vibe. I know that sounds imprecise, but I don't have better language for it. These homes, these people, they created an atmosphere of calm, unhurried certainty. There was no anxiety in their movements, no rushing, no visible stress. They took up space without apology but also without aggression. Their homes had security systems but nothing visible, no cameras pointed at the street, no signs warning potential intruders. Everything whispered rather than shouted. And I realized this was the aesthetic that wealth actually aspires to, not the loud luxury of music videos, but this quiet, generational confidence that comes from never having been told you don't belong somewhere. She closed the notebook carefully, as if it were sacred text. I spent 6 weeks just observing and documenting before I made any moves. 6 weeks of parking on these streets, watching these patterns, absorbing this language. Margot would sleep in the back seat, and I'd sit in the front with a tiny booklight, writing down everything I noticed, trying to decode what made this particular neighborhood feel different from other wealthy areas I'd parked in. And I identified 3 core elements that I came to think of as the pillars of real wealth: the vibe, the real estate, and the assets. Lorelei walked to the window, looking out at her street. The vibe was what I've already described, that atmosphere of quiet luxury, of time abundance, of aesthetic consistency even in small moments. I started training myself to move like these people moved, slowly, deliberately, like I had nowhere more important to be. I practiced in my car, in public bathrooms, walking through stores I couldn't afford to shop in. I taught myself to take up space calmly, to make eye contact without aggression, to dress in the simplest versions of what I owned in ways that suggested intentionality rather than poverty. When you have nothing, performance becomes survival. I was performing wealth without any of its material reality, but the performance itself started changing how people treated me. She turned back to face me, and her expression was complex. Part pride, part residual pain from what she'd endured. The real estate piece took me longer to understand, but it became the foundation of everything. I spent hours at the public library using their computers to look up property records for the homes I'd been observing. And I discovered something fascinating. Most of these properties weren't owned by individuals. They were held in LLCs, family trusts, estate structures that had been set up decades earlier. The same families had owned these homes since the 1950s, 1960s, passing them through generations, never selling, just transferring ownership within family structures that protected the assets from taxation and division. Lorelei's voice grew more animated, as if she were reliving the excitement of discovery. That's when I understood that wealth isn't actually about high income or expensive purchases. It's about owning appreciating assets and protecting them through legal structures that allow generational transfer. These families weren't rich because they made a lot of money, though many of them did. They were rich because their grandparents had bought property in San Francisco in 1955 when you could get a Pacific Heights home for $40,000, and they'd held it through every market cycle, protecting it in trusts, and now it was worth $8 million and still generating wealth for the third generation. She sat back down across from me, her tea now cold, but she sipped it anyway. I realized I needed to own property in a wealthy zip code, no matter how small or humble that property was. Because the secret wasn't the house itself. It was the land, the location, the proximity to where generational wealth clusters. Property appreciates based on neighborhood dynamics, and wealthy neighborhoods appreciate faster and more consistently because wealthy people protect their environments. They fight development that would lower property values, they invest in schools and parks and infrastructure, they create conditions that ensure their own assets grow. If I could get even the smallest foothold in one of these neighborhoods, I'd be accessing that same protective ecosystem. I asked her the obvious question: how does a homeless single mother with $800 buy property in one of the most expensive real estate markets in America? Lorelei smiled, and it was the first time I'd seen her look genuinely amused rather than just pleasantly composed. Very, very slowly, and with a willingness to tolerate discomfort that I didn't know I possessed. I took the first job I could find that didn't require an address, housecleaning for a service that paid cash daily. $10 an hour, 4 to 6 hours a day, which meant I was making maybe $50 a day on good days. I opened a bank account using a mail forwarding service as my address. I continued living in my car, but I became fanatical about saving every dollar that didn't go toward absolute necessities. Margot and I ate a lot of rice and beans, a lot of peanut butter sandwiches, a lot of the cheapest calories I could find. I showered at the Y, used public bathrooms, washed our clothes at laundromats in less expensive neighborhoods where the machines cost less per load. Her expression grew more serious. And I studied. Every spare moment, I was educating myself about real estate, about financing, about property law, about creative purchasing strategies. The public library became my university. I read every book about real estate investing they had. I watched YouTube videos about house flipping and rental properties and FHA loans. I learned about foreclosure auctions and probate sales and estate liquidations. I taught myself to read property records and tax assessments and zoning codes. I became obsessed with understanding how people with no money could acquire property, because I knew that was the only path forward. Saving my way to wealth at $10 an hour was mathematically impossible. But buying an asset that would appreciate? That was possible if I could figure out the mechanism. Lorelei pulled out another notebook, this one more recent, filled with spreadsheets and calculations. After 8 months of cleaning houses and living in my car and saving obsessively, I had $7,000. Not even close to a down payment in San Francisco, not even enough for first and last month's rent in most neighborhoods. But I'd found something in my research, a tiny duplex in the outer Richmond district, not in Pacific Heights but close enough to benefit from the overall neighborhood dynamics of wealthy San Francisco. The property was in probate. The elderly owner had died with no direct heirs, and the distant relatives just wanted it sold quickly for cash so they could divide the inheritance. It was listed for $280,000, which was absurdly cheap even in 2016, but it had problems. Significant problems. The foundation was questionable, there was water damage throughout, it smelled like something had died in the walls, and it had been sitting empty for 18 months while the probate was being resolved. She looked at me with an expression that suggested she knew how insane her next words would sound. I offered $240,000, with $7,000 down, using an FHA loan for first-time homebuyers that required only 3.5% down on properties under a certain price point. The distant relatives accepted immediately because they'd had no other offers. Most investors wouldn't touch the property because of the condition and the probate complications, and most homebuyers couldn't get conventional financing on something that distressed. But FHA loans are more flexible about property condition if you agree to make certain repairs, and I convinced the lender I could do the work myself. I must have looked skeptical because Lorelei laughed, a genuine sound of amusement at her younger self's audacity. I had no construction experience. None. I'd never repaired anything more complicated than a leaky faucet. But I'd watched enough YouTube videos that I convinced myself I could learn, and more importantly, I knew that this was my only chance. If I didn't take this risk, I'd be living in my car indefinitely, and eventually the car would die or I'd get caught or winter would come and Margot would get sick and the whole fragile system would collapse. So I took the loan, I moved into the duplex with Margot even though it was barely habitable, and I spent the next year learning construction while working full-time and raising a 4-year-old. Lorelei's voice grew quieter, and I could hear the exhaustion of that year underneath her words. I demoed everything myself, ripped out damaged drywall, tore up ruined flooring, removed the source of the smell, which turned out to be a family of raccoons that had died in the crawl space. I learned to do basic electrical work, basic plumbing, drywall repair, tile installation. For anything that required permitting or professional expertise, I found contractors willing to work for extremely low rates in exchange for cash and flexibility on timing. I bought materials from salvage yards and Habitat for Humanity restores. I furnished our living space with items I found on the street in Pacific Heights on trash night. Wealthy people throw away furniture that just needs minor repairs or reupholstering. She gestured around her current home, and I noticed details I'd missed on first glance. A dining table that had clearly been refinished, chairs that didn't match but somehow belonged together, light fixtures that looked antique but had been rewired for modern use. Everything I learned about wealthy aesthetics, I applied to the renovation. I didn't try to make the duplex look expensive, I tried to make it look intentional. Neutral colors, simple materials, quality over quantity. I painted every wall white or soft gray. I installed the simplest subway tile I could find. I chose classic fixtures that wouldn't date quickly. I created the vibe of quiet, timeless simplicity, which is what wealth actually looks like when it's not performing for Instagram. Lorelei pulled out before and after photos of the duplex, and the transformation was startling. The before pictures showed decay and neglect. The after pictures showed a space that, while simple, had the kind of calm aesthetic cohesion I'd seen in design magazines featuring Scandinavian interiors or Japanese minimalism. The renovation took 13 months and cost me about $18,000 in materials and contractor fees. I lived in one unit with Margot while I renovated the other, then we moved into the renovated unit while I fixed up our space. By the time I was finished, I'd created 2 rental-quality units in a neighborhood that was starting to gentrify because of its proximity to Golden Gate Park and the Presidio. She showed me rental listings from that period. I rented one unit for $1,900 a month, which covered my mortgage payment of $1,600 and gave me a small cushion. Margot and I lived in the other unit, and I continued working, now doing property management for other small landlords I'd met through real estate investor meetups. I'd positioned myself as someone who understood both the maintenance side and the tenant relations side, and I was willing to work for lower fees than established property management companies. I was building expertise, building a network, and building equity. Lorelei's voice took on a note of something like wonder. And then the magic of real estate appreciation started working. I'd bought in 2016 for $240,000. By 2018, comparable duplexes in the outer Richmond were selling for $400,000. By 2020, they were selling for $550,000. I'd done nothing except hold the property, maintain it competently, and keep it rented. The neighborhood was changing around me, new restaurants, improved transit, young families moving in because they were priced out of more expensive areas, and my equity was growing by tens of thousands of dollars a year. She pulled out a spreadsheet showing the progression of her portfolio, and I saw the pattern immediately: acquire distressed property in appreciating neighborhood, renovate to create quiet luxury aesthetic, hold and rent, use equity to acquire next property. In 2019, I refinanced the duplex based on its appreciated value and pulled out $80,000 in equity. I used that as a down payment on a small commercial property in the Bayview district. Nothing fancy, just a 3-unit building with retail on the ground floor and apartments above. Same strategy, distressed property, probate sale, motivated sellers. I offered cash for quick close using my equity from the duplex. Purchased for $420,000, spent $30,000 on cosmetic improvements, rented the retail space to a coffee roaster and the apartments to long-term tenants. Lorelei looked at me directly, and her expression was intense. Do you understand what was happening? I wasn't making huge amounts of money from income. The rental income just covered mortgages and maintenance with small margins. But I was building equity through appreciation, and I was using that equity to acquire more assets, which generated more equity. The wealth wasn't in the cash flow, it was in the ownership of appreciating assets in neighborhoods where wealthy people were protecting their own property values. She continued, her voice gaining momentum. By 2021, my duplex was worth $650,000 and my commercial building was worth $700,000. I had equity of over $400,000 across both properties. I used that to acquire this estate. Lorelei gestured to the home around us, and I finally asked the question I'd been holding since I arrived. How does someone go from a distressed duplex to a Pacific Heights estate in 5 years? Her smile was knowing, as if she'd been waiting for this question. This property was an estate sale. The previous owner had died at 97, her children were all in their 70s and living in other states, and none of them wanted to manage the property or deal with the emotional weight of liquidating their mother's home. It had been on the market for 9 months, listed at $3.8 million, but it needed significant work, outdated systems, deferred maintenance, cosmetic updates throughout. Most buyers in this price range wanted move-in ready. They wanted to write a check and walk into perfection. But I'd spent 5 years learning to see potential instead of problems. Lorelei pulled up the original listing, and I saw a home that looked tired despite its good bones. I offered $3.2 million, all cash, quick close, no inspection contingencies, and I'd take the property as is with all the furniture and contents. The family accepted immediately because they were exhausted by the process and they wanted it over. I used a complex financing structure. I took out a loan against my accumulated equity, brought in a private investor who became a limited partner in exchange for part ownership, and structured the purchase through an LLC to protect my personal assets. The same strategies wealthy families had been using for generations, I'd learned by studying their property records and consulting with real estate attorneys I'd met through networking. She walked me through the house, pointing out renovations she'd completed over 3 years. Same principles as the duplex, just scaled up. Quality materials, timeless aesthetic, attention to detail. I did as much work as I could myself and hired specialists for everything else. Total renovation budget was $400,000, which sounds like a fortune until you realize that comparable estates in this neighborhood that are fully updated sell for $6 to $8 million. I created a property worth conservatively $6 million for a total investment of $3.6 million. We returned to the sunroom, and Lorelei poured fresh tea. But the estate itself isn't the victory. The structure is. This property is held in a family trust with my daughter Margot as co-trustee. She's 13 now, and she's learning what I had to teach myself: how to evaluate property, how to understand markets, how to think in generations rather than years. The duplex is held in a separate LLC that will eventually transfer to her. The commercial building is structured as a partnership. None of these assets are in my personal name in a way that would make them vulnerable to lawsuits or divorces or estate taxes. I'm building exactly what I observed in those public records: generational wealth protected through legal structures that ensure it stays in the family. Lorelei's expression grew more complex, tinged with something that looked like vindication mixed with residual anger. My daughter's father reached out 2 years ago. He'd heard through mutual acquaintances that I was doing well, and he wanted to reconnect, suggested that maybe we could try again, that he'd changed, that he missed our family. I declined. Calmly, firmly, without drama. Because the best revenge isn't confrontation, it's compound interest. It's building something so solid that the person who tried to diminish you becomes completely irrelevant to your success. He wanted me dependent and uncertain. I became wealthy and certain. His opinion of me no longer matters because I've built a reality where his validation is worthless. She stood and walked to a framed photograph on the wall, a young girl, around 13, standing in front of what looked like a European villa. Margot spent last summer in Italy, studying architecture and art history. She's fluent in Italian now, learning French, planning to attend boarding school in Switzerland for high school. Not because I'm trying to erase where we came from, but because I'm teaching her to move through the world like she belongs everywhere. The way wealthy children are taught to move through the world, with curiosity, confidence, and the assumption that any door will open if you know how to knock properly. Lorelei returned to her seat, and her voice took on a different quality, something between teacher and evangelist. So what is the code to generational wealth? It's not a secret, though it's invisible to most people because they're looking in the wrong places. The code has 3 elements that work together: the vibe, the real estate, and the assets. She ticked them off on her fingers. The vibe is the atmosphere you create and inhabit. It's moving slowly and deliberately like you have nowhere more important to be. It's wearing simple, quality pieces repeatedly rather than chasing trends. It's cultivating spaces that feel calm and intentional rather than chaotic or showy. It's understanding that wealth signals safety, not excitement. Wealthy people are boring in specific ways. They wear the same things, eat at the same restaurants, vacation in the same places, because they're not trying to impress anyone. They're trying to replicate conditions that feel stable and familiar. Once I understood that, I stopped trying to look wealthy through variety and started trying to look wealthy through consistency. She continued, her voice gaining intensity. The real estate piece is understanding that location matters more than the property itself. A modest house in Pacific Heights will appreciate faster than a mansion in a declining neighborhood. Wealthy families buy into wealthy neighborhoods because those neighborhoods are protected by other wealthy people's self-interest. They cluster near power, near private schools, cultural institutions, professional networks. They buy the worst house in the best neighborhood, renovate it thoughtfully, and hold it forever, passing it to their children in trust structures that avoid estate taxes. They don't flip properties for quick cash. They build equity through appreciation and use that equity to acquire more appreciating assets. Lorelei leaned forward, and I could see the passion underneath her composed exterior. And the assets piece is about understanding that real wealth is tangible. It's not your salary or your savings account. It's what you own that will be worth more tomorrow than it is today. Property, yes, but also businesses, intellectual property, collections that appreciate, relationships with institutions. Wealthy families teach their children to acquire assets early, protect them legally, and never sell unless you're trading up to a better asset. They live below their visible means, not because they're cheap, but because they understand that lifestyle inflation is the enemy of wealth building. Every dollar you spend on consumption is a dollar that's not working for you through appreciation or compound interest. She paused, looking at me with an expression that suggested she was evaluating whether I truly understood what she was sharing. Most people think wealth is about earning a high income. But I know people earning $500,000 a year who are living paycheck to paycheck because they spend everything on lifestyle. And I know families earning $80,000 a year who are building generational wealth because they're acquiring assets, protecting them legally, and teaching their children to do the same. The difference isn't income, it's financial literacy about how wealth actually works. Lorelei walked to her desk and pulled out a folder. I teach now. I run workshops for single mothers, for people recovering from financial trauma, for anyone who's ready to learn the language of wealth. I share everything I learned: how to find distressed properties, how to creative finance with limited capital, how to renovate for maximum value, how to create trust structures, how to move through wealthy spaces without triggering the gatekeepers. I don't charge for these workshops. This is my contribution to breaking the cycle, the same way someone broke it for me. I asked who had helped her, expecting a mentor figure to emerge in the story. Lorelei shook her head. No one helped me directly. I learned by observation, by studying public records, by reading everything I could find, by trial and error and risking everything multiple times. But the wealthy neighborhood helped me indirectly. By clustering together, by protecting their property values, by creating stable appreciating conditions, they created an ecosystem I could access once I got that first toehold. They didn't help me intentionally, they helped me structurally. She looked out the window again, her expression contemplative. Sometimes I drive past that parking spot on Pacific Avenue where I used to sleep in my car. The street looks exactly the same trees, same quiet, same expensive calm. But I see it differently now. Then, I was outside looking in, trying to understand a world I didn't have access to. Now I'm inside, and I own part of the structure that creates that world. I own 3 properties within 2 miles of where I was homeless. My daughter will inherit those properties. Her children will inherit them from her. The cycle is broken. Lorelei stood, and I understood our conversation was ending. She walked me to the door, and as we stood in the entryway underneath a chandelier that had probably been there since 1925, she offered one final observation. The saddest thing about wealth inequality isn't that some people have more than others. It's that the knowledge of how wealth works is itself unequally distributed. If everyone understood that wealth is about assets not income, about appreciation not consumption, about legal structures not salary, the playing field would be more level. But that knowledge is often kept within families, passed down privately, taught through osmosis and access rather than through public education. I'm trying to change that, one workshop at a time, one single mother at a time, one person who's ready to learn the language. We shook hands again, and as I walked back down her stone pathway toward the gate that was already swinging open for my departure, I turned back to look at her. She was still standing in her doorway, framed by the beautiful architecture of her home, and I realized something that made me fundamentally reconsider the story I'd come to write. She'd never been homeless in the way I'd understood homelessness. She'd been temporarily displaced in location, but never in mindset. Even in that car with her 3-year-old daughter, she'd been studying, planning, observing, positioning herself to understand and replicate the patterns of wealth. She'd been poor in resources but wealthy in pattern recognition, and once she'd decoded the language, the material reality followed with an inevitability that looked like luck but was actually strategy. The gate closed behind me with a soft mechanical click, and I stood on the public sidewalk looking back at an estate that represented not just one woman's triumph but a fundamental truth about how wealth actually works in America. It's not earned through labor alone. It's built through asset ownership, protected through legal structures, and passed through generations using knowledge that remains largely invisible to people who need it most. I drove home thinking about what would change in my own life, in my own financial decisions, if I stopped studying wealth as an outsider and started learning to speak its language fluently. If I stopped envying what wealthy people consumed and started replicating what they owned. If I thought in generations rather than years, in equity rather than income, in structures rather than salaries. Lorelei Ashford had cracked the code to generational wealth not by getting lucky or inheriting money or marrying rich, but by observing patterns that were hidden in plain sight, learning a language that was being spoken all around her, and having the courage to apply that knowledge even when she had nothing to lose except the car she was sleeping in. She'd studied the vibe until she could replicate it. She'd understood the real estate game until she could play it. She'd accumulated assets until they accumulated more assets. And she'd built something that would outlast her. A structure of wealth that would protect her daughter and her daughter's children from ever sleeping in a car on Pacific Avenue, watching wealthy women walk to mailboxes and wondering what language they were speaking. That, I realized, was the code. Not a secret. Not magic. Just pattern recognition, strategic patience, and the willingness to learn a language that no one teaches you unless you're born into the family that speaks it. What did this story mean to you? Subscribe to the Rich Old Lady Story, drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like for more inspiring stories every day.